Hi everybody, it's me, Dr. Fan your lecturer for CM3361, Environmental Chemistry. So today, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, a very important element in the element cycle here. Right, so carbon with a symbol C is a definitive component of the organic molecules. I teach organic chemistry and I'm sure you have done all your OChem, right? So this carbon cycle describe the routes that the carbon atoms, right, will take through the environment in the carbon cycle and that involve us. So we'll be going through four parts in this carbon cycle. Number one, photosynthesis. Look at the sun behind me, the sunlight here, right? We talk about respiration and the food web to give us energy, right, and grow. Number two, we will talk about the sediment storage of carbon, right? Where carbons are stored, it is more than meets the eye. Number three, we talk about the oceans. How does the ocean trap carbons? And number four, the human impact on the carbon cycle. So you realize that the humans always come into play of the element cycle. Now, first, for photosynthesis, respiration, and the food webs producers such as the plants, algae, and cyanobacteria, they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of the surface water used in the photosynthesis, right? They just take it out. So photosynthesis, like due to the chlorophyll in the green plants here, they convert the CO2 and water into glucose and oxygen. And the autotrophs, right, use some of these carbohydrates to feed the cellular respiration and therefore releasing some of this carbon in the form of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere and into the oceans, right? And the CO2 can dissolve somewhat in the water in the oceans. Now, when producers are eaten by primary consumers, right? So producers are your like green plants here. Primary consumers are like your herbivores, right? So they are then subsequently eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers, right? Like the omnivore or the carnivore, right? Meat-consuming creatures. So the more carbohydrates are broken down into the cellular respiration, producing CO2 and water. It's like a process, cylindrical process. And the same process occurs when it decomposes consume waste and dead organic matters. Don't just think that decomposers, we don't see them, they eat nothing. They still consume the dead matters, right? Now, organisms, right, use this carbon for structural growth, right? Even DNA has a polymer containing carbon in its deoxyribose sugar. So a portion of this carbon is incorporated into our tissues, in the tissues, right? And because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so a lot of research on the global climate change is directed to measure the amount of CO2 that the plants store, right? To see how it can influence the Earth's climate, right? Does it mean that when you plant more plants, trees, you will help to dampen climate change? We see next time. Now, next, part two is the sediment storage of carbon. When aquatic organism dies, the remains, right, the carcasses may settle in the sediments in the ocean basins or even freshwater wetlands. And as the sediments accumulates, right, they stack up, the older layers are buried more deeply. Unsurprising, right? It stacks, experiencing a higher pressure over a long period of time than the fossil, right? So pressure and compressive, and these conditions with high pressure, with stacking, convert all these soft tissues, right, into fossil fuels like such as the coal, oil, natural gas, and this can turn the shells and skeletons into sedimentary rocks such as the limestone, calcium carbonate, CaCO3. And the carbon trap in these sedimentary rocks, right, may just reside there, stay there for hundreds of millions of years. Now, carbon that's trapped in these sedimentary rocks and fossil fuels deposits may eventually be released to the ocean or atmosphere by geological processes such as uplift erosions or volcanic eruptions, right? The tectonic plates collides. It can also re-enter the atmosphere when we extract them, or we hunt them down, extract them, and burn the fossil fuels. Now, next, we'll be talking about the oceans. Now, the ocean's the second largest reservoir in the carbon cycle. Can you believe it? Now, the oceans absorb these carbon-containing compounds right from the atmosphere. Like, please don't say sky, right? Terrestrial runoff and undersea volcanoes, and from the waste products and the detritus of marine organisms. Now, some examples include the CO2, carbonate ions, CO3 2 negative, and the bicarbonate ions. And the bicarbonate ions combines with the calcium ions to form the solid calcium carbonate, right? An essential ingredient in the exoskeleton, the skeletons or shells. And when the organism dies, this calcium carbonate shall sink to the ocean floor and begins to form the sedimentary rock. Now the rate, this is more kinetics, the rate in which the ocean absorb and release the sea carbon, right, depends on many factors. You should give a few like temperature and the number of marine organisms converting this carbon dioxide back into your carbohydrates and the carbonates. Now, lastly, we talk about the human impact on the carbon cycle. One of the main impacts is shifting carbon from the lithosphere, right, to the atmosphere. So if we mine fossil fuels, right, these deposits remove carbon from the underground reservoirs, and with resident time of millions of years, right, it stacks up. So combustion of these fossil fuels, in our automobile industries and the homes and industries, they release CO2 so easily, right? And that's very quick increase in the flux of the carbon from the ground to the air. Now, since the mid 18th century, the combustion of fossil fuels has added almost 276 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, right? Just by burning, simple. Now, the movement of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back to the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere, however, hasn't kept pace. So that means it's more on overall a one directional, it's not achieving equilibrium, which means there's a problem, right? And humans are not helping it. So the cutting down of forest, clearing the trees, right, remove carbon from the pool of vegetations and it releases it back to the air, right? And if there's less vegetation left on the surface, there are fewer plants to draw the CO2 back from the atmosphere. So the outgoing flux of carbon to the atmosphere is the driving force behind today's anthropogenic global climate change, right? Remember this factor. Now, some excess CO2 in atmosphere is now being absorbed by the ocean water, right? So but the thing is, you may think, oh, we remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but the ocean is becoming acidic because carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid, weakly acidic. So when the ocean water becomes slightly acidic, it threatens marine life. Now, our understanding of the carbon cycle is not complete. You have to read deeper, right? There is a missing carbon sink for the carbon dioxide emitted by fossil fuels combustions and deforestation. So we remove the sink. Where can we take back the carbon, right? Now, however, we know that researchers try to measure how much it goes to the atmosphere and oceans. They do calculations, simulations, right? And they find that about roughly 2.3 to 2.6 billion metric tons of the carbon remains unaccounted for. So, there are many scientists who believe that CO2 must be taken up by plants, right? And also by the temperate and the boreal forests. But if certain forests are acting as a major sink for carbon, right, we would like to keep it that way. But if these forests were to turn from sinks to sources and begin to release the missing carbon that we couldn't account for, climate change could accelerate drastically. So I want to leave you a simple thought here, right? Go through this again and think. I'll leave you here. So that brings us to the end of the carbon cycle. I'll see you next time. Cheers.